So this conference is about streaming analytics. I thought I'd start with where Numenta sees itself fitting into the future world of streaming analytics. So this is our view of the future. It's one where there are many, many sources of data in the world. So many things in the world are getting instrumented. And instead of putting those in a database and analyzing them later, we envision a future where we have many sources of data. They're streaming to online models. Those models process the data in real time and from them make predictions, anomalies, detect anomalies, and take actions. The issue of scaling we're dealing with is not one of the size of the data, but it's the number of data sources. So we're imagining billions of data sources, every car, every building, every door, every parking meter sending and collecting data, and we have to have millions of models. So how do we get to that point where you have this very large number of models and things being analyzed in a streaming fashion? There's a lot of things you have to do to get to that point, but we're going to focus on two things in this talk, the issue of online learning and high-order sequence memory. And just to be clear what those mean, online learning means models that are built up one record at a time. There's no training set, there's no test set. It's just the records come in, record at a time, and the models build and adapt in real time. High-order sequence memory is just referring to the fact that how far back in time you have to go to detect anomalies or to make predictions. You may not have to go a few steps back in time, maybe you have to go 10 steps back in time. So any model that's going to be taking streaming data from sensors has to have a good temporal model and has to have a sort of either a high order or variable order, a model built around that. How far back in time do you need to go in order to make predictions? Here's the agenda for this talk. I'm going to start with a little bit of description of the brain as a streaming analytics engine. Then I'm going to talk about sparse distributed representations, which are the types of representations used in the brain. Then we're going to talk about how to build high-order sequence memory of sparse distributed representations. We're going to talk about how to make that memory online. And then we're going to talk about a product we've built around these principles. Here's the goals for our company, Numenta, which might seem a little surprising. It's to discover the principles of operation in the neocortex and then to build systems that operate on those principles. This is really about machine intelligence. And you might say, well, what does it have to do with streaming data? Well, it turns out that the brain, the neocortex in particular, is a predictive modeling system. You have some sensors, the retina, cochlea, and touch sensors, which are actually many, many sensors, and they create a high-velocity data stream, which is fed to the neocortex. The neocortex, when you're born, really doesn't know anything, sort of a blank memory structure, if you will. And from the streaming data from your senses, it has to build a model of the world. And then, of course, among other things, the neocortex is constantly making predictions, it's detecting anomalies, and it's generating behavior. So this is very much a sense of what we need to do with the world's senses. So if we understand how the brain does this, we can perhaps do a better job of it in our technology. Now, we've learned a lot about how the brain works and how the neocortex works. So I'm going to break it down into just a few high-level points I'm going to talk about, and then we'll go into some details. The first high-level point, you can think about the neocortex as a hierarchy. It is physically structured as a hierarchy. The regions in the neocortex are connected in sort of a tree-shaped hierarchy, as shown here. The second most important principle we've learned about how it works is that the individual elements in the hierarchy, the regions, if you will, that are connected together, are all implementing a form of sequence memory. They're all learning about how patterns change over time, and they're all making predictions, and they're all basically detecting anomalies. So this is a common theme throughout here. In fact, if you need some convincing, just think about my speech. I'm generating a very, very high velocity data stream, and as you're listening to me, you have to infer on that high velocity data stream. And you have to have sequence memory in order to do that. And the third thing is that the whole system is built around sparse distributed representations, which I'll talk about more in a second. So those are our three high-level principles, and as I said, we've made a lot of progress understanding how these work. Now, what we're going to do going forward, we're just going to talk about two of them. It turns out that we can do a lot if we just actually model just one region in the neocortex. Even a small part of one region in the neocortex is quite powerful. So I've highlighted that in the green box here. So we want to understand how we take a section of the neocortex and build a sequence memory around that using sparse distributed representations. The goal of all this is to build a system that looks like this, where on the left we show streaming data coming in record at a time, multivariate data, one or more fields. We're going to put them through a set of encoders to turn them into sparse distributed representations. We're going to run those into a sequence memory, and from that we'll be able to make predictions and to detect anomalies. So let's now go into our first major topic, which is sparse distributed representations. So what is a sparse distributed representation? It is a representation that actually has many bits. We typically use 2,000 bits in our work in Numenta, but it could be more, a little bit less than that. And it's sparse because very few of those bits are active. So a typical representation for us is 2,000 bits, of which 2% or 40 are ones, and the remainder, or 1960s, are zeros. Now, the key element of this is that the bits themselves have meaning. They have semantic meaning. In contrast, if I were to ask you what's the third bit in an ASCII encoding, you couldn't tell me what that means. It means nothing. You have to look at all the bits. But here, in a sparse distributed representation, every bit means something. And so what we're doing is when we represent an object, we take the top 40 attributes. And that's the ones we assign to 1, and all the others we assign to 0. So we're going to pick the top attributes that apply to the particular object we're talking about. If I wanted to encode a letter, for example, as an alternate to ASCII, the attributes might be, is it a vowel or a consonant? Is it a closed loop or an open loop? Does it have ascenders or descenders? Or what does it sound like? Where it is in the alphabet, and so on. Now, we can ask ourselves, what are some properties of these sparse distributed representations which we're going to use in our sequence memory? And they're very, very important. The first one is that you can compare two sparse distributed representations bit by bit. And if there's a bit in the same location in two representations, that means they share an attribute. This is not something that happens by accident. So very quickly I can say, give me two representations and say how they're similar and how they're different. I just look at the bit comparison. This is a significant thing. Even if I have 5 bits in common, it's highly significant that says the two representations share some important semantic representations. The second thing we can do is we might ask, how would I store a sparse distributed representation? So let's say I had one and I wanted to store it and see if it occurred again later. Well, instead of saving all 2,000 bits, we would save the indices to the ones. So we have 40 ones, we would say the 40 indices of those 1 bits. And now if I see those, if I have a new representation and I say, well, let's look at those 40 locations. If they're ones, then we say we have a perfect match. Now, something else we can do, which we're going to take advantage of, is let's say I couldn't save the location of all 40 bits. I could only save a subset of them, maybe 10. We would call that subsampling. And it turns out that if you subsample, you're almost as good. So instead of saving the locations of 40 bits, if I save the locations of 10, and I find that those 10 bits are present, I can almost be guaranteed that I have the correct representation. Now, you might say, well, it could be an error, and it could be. But even if I did make an error, what if I recognize those 10 bits in a different representation? It would be semantically very, very similar to the thing I actually did store originally. So it wouldn't be a huge failure. It would be pretty close to the original. And this is an efficiency that we're going to take advantage of throughout our work, and it's something that the brain does as well. The final property we need to know is one of union. If I took 10 sparse distributed representations and I ORed them together, just literally did an OR, and I would now end up with a new representation, which is again the same number of bits, but instead of being 2% of the bits 1, it'd be about 20%, or be a little bit less than 20%. Now that's a one-way street. I can OR these representations together. I can't extract them. But there's something I can do. I can ask, if I have an unknown, is it a member of that original 10? And so here's an unknown, and all I have to do is find out, are the ones in the unknown have the same ones in the locations in the ORed version of the 10? And if they are, I'll contend that we have a perfect match. You might say, hey, but it's possible that I could make a mistake. Maybe I'm matching up some ones from one representation and some ones from another representation. That is true. It's possible. But if you do the math, it's quite simple. It's simple to show that it's almost impossible to happen. That if you find a match this way, you're virtually guaranteed that the unknown is part of that 10. We're going to use this later because what our system's going to do is it's going to make multiple predictions at the same time, and we want to know if a new element is part of that multiple prediction, and we're going to form these multiple predictions using an OR like this, a union. All right, so there's our 3 properties we're going to use, and now we want to get into how is it we form a sequence memory of these? How do we learn patterns in time of sparse distributed representations? We're going to start by going back to the brain very briefly. And here I've just shown a couple of pictures in sequence here, starting with the neocortex. If we look at a little small section of the neocortex, and we took a little section of it, you'd see in the second picture that the cells are arranged in layers and columns. And if I took a look at one layer and a small section of a layer, you'd see that the cells are in there, they're tightly packed in there. But in that one layer, there's 2 organizing principles. In the green line, I show that the cells, which are represented by those little circles, the cells that are in a vertical column, literally a very skinny little vertical column, they share the same feed-forward response properties. They seem to have the same sort of meaning in the world. The vast majority of connections are horizontal across the columns, and that's shown in orange. And so the vast majority of connections are between columns, but all the cells in a column seem to have a similar response property. If I now take a look at one of those cells, there's a picture of, in the fourth image, is a picture of a pyramidal neuron from the neocortex. The most prominent thing you see about this cell is it has all these branch-like structures, which are called dendrites. And this is where all the connections to the cell are made. And in the final picture, we zoom in on one of the dendrites, and we'll see that you can see the actual synapses or connections to other cells along the branch of that dendrite. One of the things we've learned in the last 15 years in neuroscience is that synapses on a dendrite that are close together in one little segment act as a unit. We might consider them as a coincidence detector. That is, if we have some number of those synapses become active at the same time in a very short distance from each other, it can generate a spike on the dendrite and make the cell active. So you've got all these little branches, but they're acting like little independent sort of coincidence detectors. We are going to model just a portion of this whole system. We're going to model just a small section of a layer of cells. And such. Here's an image of one of our simulations that we've done. And the different colors of those rectangles, those little squares, are the different activation states. Then if we look at one of the cells, how do we model a neuron? This is shown on the right, and I'll just talk about one part of it. You notice the blue dots. Those are like the connections on the dendrites. And so we show a series of what they're equivalent to dendritic segments, but we consider them like coincidence detectors. So on those blue dots or those connections, if some of them are active at the same time above a certain threshold, then the cell will fire. Okay, so that's the structure that we've learned from the neocortex. And the question we want to ask now is, how does this structure learn sequences? What makes it high order, and what makes it online? So let's just go into how it learns the sequences. So we're going to take our 2,000 bits and array them in an array like we showed the cells before, but this is really just our 2,000-bit array. And here we're showing in red the cells that are active. So the 2% of the cells are active, and obviously this is not all 2,000 cells. This is just a subset of that, but it helps for illustration. So this is a representation of our sparse distributed representation. Now at any point in time, say it's at time 1, some of these cells will be active, and then you go to another point in time with another input, a different set of cells will be active. And so you're going to be cycling through these changing sparse distributed representations, and the question is, how do we learn this transition, and how do we do this in a very smart way? The way we're going to do that is when a cell becomes active, it's going to look for cells that were active immediately prior to that. And it's going to say, look, those cells, if I see them, are going to be ones that indicate that I'm going to become active next. So here's an example. I show in yellow a cell that says, okay, I become active. What was active just before me? And I will connect to those cells nearby on one of my dendrites. And if I see them active again, I will anticipate my own behavior. Again, I don't have to connect to all the previously active cells, just a subset is fine. And every cell is doing this. Every one of the bits, in some sense, in our representation is trying to anticipate its activity. And when it becomes active, it forms connections to cells that are active previously. If you do this and you train it on some patterns, you'll end up with a state like this. The red cells are the current input, and that means this is my current input from my sensory organs or from my data. And the yellow cells are the predicted ones, the ones that are saying, hey, this is what's likely to happen next. Here you see there's quite a few yellow cells, so this represents a multiple prediction. Imagine if I had a pattern that went from, I saw patterns of A is followed by B, and then A is followed by C, and then A is followed by D. Well, if I showed you A, then it should predict B, C, and D as potential next steps. And that's what you're basically seeing in this state right here. Now in this case, we've only shown it one cell per column, and this is what we would call a first order memory, meaning our prediction is only based on the previous state. So you can only use one step in time to make a prediction. There's no possible way of knowing what happened 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 steps ago to influence our prediction, which is one of the things we want to do. The answer to that question, how do we do that, is we're going to use multiple cells per column. We're going to use, in this case, showing 4 here, but let me illustrate it on the next slide. I'm going to show you 2 sparse distributed representations. They're exactly the same, so these zeros and ones are the same pattern. And above each bit, I'm showing 10 little circles representing sort of 10 cells, if you will. And when a bit is 1, we would say that that column of cells is active, but we're only going to let one of the cells, one of the 10 above each one, be active. So in the upper picture, I show a pattern where I picked one set of cells in each column, and then in the lower one, I show a different set of cells in each column. So if I look at the active cells, they're quite different in this case. We can just pick these randomly to begin with, and if a few cells are the same in each column, it really doesn't matter. Now you can ask yourself, think about it this way. If there are 40 active bits, 41s, and there's 10 cells per column, then there's 10 to the 40 different ways to represent the same input. There's 10 to the 40 different ways to represent the same input in different contexts. It's as if I was saying the sound two, and I said there are too many tutus to count. Each time I said the sound two, it meant something different, and you didn't get confused. You were able to track through that pattern. And that's basically the way we believe the brain does this. So now we have the ability to learn many, many different ways to represent the same thing. And this is the essence of building our high-order sequence memory. And we can do the same sort of connectivity we showed before in going through the memory in that way. I won't detail it any further. So what we've shown now is we've shown an ability of memory of sequences of sparse distributed representations. I haven't shown you this, but the capacity of this memory is very, very high. I've shown you it was a very high capacity to represent the same input in different ways, but the actual sequence memory itself can be quite high. It's a high-order memory. It can make multiple simultaneous predictions, and it can do semantic generalization, which I didn't really illustrate, but essentially it says, if I've learned a sequence, and now I show you some new patterns which have semantic similarity to the previous patterns, I can apply the previously learned sequence to the new semantically similar but different patterns. Okay, so that's great. Now we want to go on to how do we make this an online system? How do we make it so that it basically trains on every record and there's no training and test set? Now think about this. If you have a trained system and a new pattern comes in it's never seen before, well, it might be noise or it might be the beginning of a new trend. We really don't know. Our system has to treat it as if it's the beginning of a new trend, but it has to also accept the fact that it might be noise. So essentially we have to learn on every record. We don't have a choice. You can't get to wait a while and see if it repeats. So we start learning on every record, and the basic philosophy will be, if the pattern repeats, we're going to reinforce it. If the pattern doesn't repeat, we're going to forget it, and then it'll go away. Again, we're going to use biology for this. Remember earlier we told how a cell would form connections to cells nearby. Those connections are illustrated in the middle diagram here on one of the dendritic segments of our cells. And then on the right I'm showing a picture of a real dendrite again. Now we've learned something important about synapses and dendrites in the last 15 years. Another important thing, which is that synapses, these connections between cells, can form very rapidly. It used to be believed that almost all learning was in the strength or the changing of the weight of those synapses. We now know that synapses can form and disappear in a matter of a minute or so. They can be very rapid. So it's believed that a lot of memory formation is occurring with the formation of synapses and the growth of them. And so we're going to take advantage of that fact. Here's how we do that. We take every connection as a binary weight. It's sort of like saying it's either connected or it's not connected. We don't bother trying to model the strength of a connection. However, we need to use something to indicate the growth and the diminishing of the connection. We call that connection permanent, which is a scalar value. So we can go from 0 to 1, where 0 is a synapse is just a potential synapse. It's not connected. Hasn't grown at all. And once it gets above a certain threshold, in this case 0.2, we would say it is connected. And the more we train it, the stronger it gets. That means that the more permanent it gets, we can go all the way up to 1. So it becomes harder to forget that guy if it's been repeated multiple times. That's pretty much all you need to do to make the system an online learning system. We have this connection permanence as a scalar, and we change the permanence. We move it up and down when we train. So if we're strengthening something, we move the permanence to the right, we increase it, and then when we're forgetting something, we decrement it. Okay, now we've taken all of this and we've produced a product called Grok, which is a prediction engine for streaming data. So I thought I'd illustrate a little bit about Grok so you get a sense for how we take these principles and put them into practice. Go back to our diagram earlier. This is what Grok does. It takes a stream of records. Each record consists of one or more fields. Those fields can be numbers, categories, text, date, time, pretty much any kind of data. The important thing is that for different types of data, we have encoders, and we turn them into sparse distributed representations. So if I have a number, I turn it into a sparse distributed representation. If I have a category, I put it into a sparse distributed representation, and so on. Dates and time, same thing. Now that we have these sparse distributed representations, we run it through our sequence memory, which is typically 2,000 cortical columns, 60,000 neurons. It has the behavior we talked about, a variable order and online learning, and then we get predictions and anomalies out of it. From a user's perspective, this is what they have to do. They have to define their problem. So for your user of Grok, you have to say what is it you want to predict, how often you want to predict it, how far in advance you want to predict it. You might be getting data every 15 minutes, and you say, I want to predict something 4 hours or 6 hours in advance. And you also have to provide an error metric, which is sort of saying like, what's the value of getting my prediction right and what's the cost of getting it wrong in different scenarios? And this is really essential to understand this because Grok's going to try to build the best model it can for your problem, and it needs to know the error metric for your problem. Once you've defined the problem, you can create a data stream. You essentially include all the potentially useful fields. You don't know if it necessarily whether they're useful or not, but you include them, and you tell Grok what the field types are. Grok, using a process that's a highly parallel process, it determines the best model it can. It figures out which fields to use that help it make the best prediction. It determines how to encode those fields. And it even does like record aggregation, which will say, hey, you know what, you've been collecting data every 5 minutes, but I think I should group them together into every 15 minutes or something like that. The output of Grok is not just a prediction, it's a distribution of predictions. It may have one or more predictions at any point in time, and we can assign probabilities to those. So you might get back this 3 predictions, the top one is 60%, and so on. And of course, it learns continuously. We've been talking to lots of customers in different areas. I won't get into this in detail here, but there's many, many possible ways you can use Grok in making predictions. In energy pricing, energy demand, product forecasting, picking what ad networks to run on, making machines more efficient, and predicting server loads, things like that. So we're just starting to figure out where this is going to be applied. I thought I would show you a few examples give you a sense for what it's like to look at Grok. Here is essentially a diagram showing the actual and a predicted value. This is the energy consumed in a building, and the red line is the prediction, and the blue line is the actual. And then here you can see this is a repetitive pattern. This data is collected every hour, and it turns out there's a daily cycle. We didn't know that going in, but Grok can figure that out if that's the case. You can see it looks like it's doing a pretty good job predicting this, but you have to be very careful. You can't just look at the picture of something like this and say, is it providing a lot of value? You have to ask, what is the error metric? How hard is it to make these predictions, and so on. But on the surface, we can say it looks pretty good. Now, what you might know of a couple things here, and some of these are a little bit narrower than others, the 2 in the middle there. Well, it turns out that's a Saturday and a Sunday. They have a little bit different profile than Mondays through Fridays, and of course, Grok picks that up as well. The bottom diagram illustrates the same building and the same input. In fact, it uses the same Y scale, the vertical scale, but it's at a different point in time, a different epoch. And you can see at this point in time, the energy usage has gone up significantly. And all the point of this is showing this is that a fixed model wouldn't work well here. Grok has to adjust to the new data and has to try to make predictions based on how things have been looking recently. So it's showing the online nature of prediction. A few more slides here. In these slides, just look at the images on the right. That's the most important. And here we're showing all 2,000 of our bits. The green dots are essentially saying this is what the current input is, and it was predicted. So this is a perfect match. It's saying, you know what happened exactly matched what was expected. And that happens actually a fair amount of time. So that's a perfect one prediction, one input. It got it right, exactly. Here's an illustration showing when Grok was making multiple predictions. So the blue circles represent other predictions that didn't occur, but the green ones are predictions that did occur. So here you see there's several predictions that were made at the same time, and what actually occurred was a subset of them, so one of the actual predictions was correct, and so this is, again, a very, very good fit, but there are alternate possible things that might have happened here. And my final image is one where we show some errors. Here we see all 3 types of things. The red circles are something that actually occurred in the world. These were some of the bits that were turned out to be 1 from the input, but were not predicted, so those were errors. The blue were things that were predicted but didn't happen, and the green dots are things that were predicted and did happen. So here you can see, even in an error or in an anomaly, it's a little bit nuanced. You can ask yourself, well, it wasn't completely wrong because it's got some of these correct, and you can also say, where was it wrong? What semantic meanings was it wrong, and where was it right? So it's sort of an ensemble model of voting here as to what it means to be correct and not correct. So in summary, I've talked about a future where we have billions of data sources, millions of models. In that future, we have to get to a point where we can programmatically create these millions of models. And so you need systems that are online, that don't require a human to test and train and things like that. 2 of the necessary capabilities of these online models is that they have to be high-order sequence memory, and they have to be online learning. The Neocortex suggests that a robust solution involves sparse distributed representations and a distributed sequence memory based on the architecture of the Neocortex. We've built this and tested extensively. It works very well, and we're getting close to a commercial implementation of these principles. We're currently in a private beta. If you're interested, you can read more about some of the basic algorithms in a white paper on our website, and there's even some pseudocode there. Although we don't describe all the details about how Grok works, we talk about the basic core algorithms for learning. And that's it. Thank you very much.